Can I do that after lunch? I didn't even have any alcohol. Democratizing party leadership selection. And I suggest that we start in the order of the papers. So that means, a good 10 to 15 minutes for everybody. And Mark Franklin would start.
Okay, well, I need to start with a disclaimer. This is not a talk about presidentialization of political parties. It's a talk about basically the relationship between party leadership and government leadership and the role played in this relationship by voters and electorates. And I'm talking about established democracies. I'm not talking about the Balkans. All I know about the Balkans I learned this morning, which wasn't a lot, though very interesting. And I have to say, as part of this disclaimer, that we really have no idea, as political scientists, how long it takes for a parliament. The problem that parliamentary and presidential governments are designed to solve is how to get conclusive decisions as to who will be the government on the basis of democratic procedures. And this graph, quasi-graph, imaginary graph, illustrates the problem. When you have one or two parties, the outcome of the election is very definitive. Either one of them wins, or the other one wins. In the case of only one party, we know which one will win, and has a majority of seats and can form a government. As the number of parties go up, you get more choice. Two parties to choose between isn't much choice, but as you get more choice, you get less definitive outcomes. So the attraction of presidentialism to constitution writers is that you get a progressive winnowing of the field of candidates until you have just two left, and then you can have an election between those two. Whether you do it as the French do with a runoff election, or whether you do it as the Americans do it by having primary elections, either way you've got the field down to the point where everybody has just two choices, and then you get a definitive outcome. But presidential government is very unstable. We know that from the times of the Roman Republic. And therefore you have to put all kinds of checks and balances around the president in order to stop unfortunate consequences. And the attraction of the parliamentary system is that you don't need these checks and balances. You can have a much more subtle relationship between voters and parties. If you look at these two pictures, you see a stylized representation of presidential government on the American model, along with a stylized representation of parliamentary government. The electorate plays a very different role in these two systems. In the presidential system, the electorate is expected to choose, to make the choice they like best at each of three levels, and then just leave it to them to fight it out over what will be the outcome. You have the fight between the House and the Senate and the President continuing for the next 4 years until the next presidential election. Voters can just sit back and watch. They've got no more part to play. In a parliamentary system, it looks much simpler, but actually it's much more complicated because the electorate plays a continuing part. It's always there. And in a classic parliamentary system, it is the final arbiter. If the government and the parliament cannot agree, If the parliament will not give the government a mandate and the government will not back down in front of the parliament, hey, you call an election and the voters ultimately decide. So even though the voters appear to have less power, they only get to make one choice after all, actually they are far more intimately involved. Except that in practice, they're almost never involved because the parties know the role that the voters can always play, and therefore the parties are always bearing in mind that the voters are sitting back there over their shoulders. And on the whole, the parties will reach accommodation within the parliament without reference to the voters because they don't want to take the chance of the wrong answer being given if they should have to appeal to the voters. So it's a very subtle, very sophisticated thing that is being asked of voters in a parliamentary system. It becomes much more multidimensional and much more subtle in the case of coalition governments. Because in the case of coalition governments, the voters are sitting looking over the shoulders of the parties as the parties engage in coalition negotiations, and they're sitting looking over the shoulders of the parties as the parties enact the program that was the decision of the coalition agreement. So in the event that one party becomes recalcitrant, that really wants to get its policies through, will not compromise, the voters know who to blame. And the other parties know how to enable the voters to blame that party. They just call an election, and that party will get it in the neck. So no party dares to be too recalcitrant. No party dares to insist too much on its programs because the voters are watching. Similarly, as the program of the coalition unfolds, which party is going to actually take the risk of being blamed for bringing the government down? No, not me, not me. So the parties continue to compromise and the coalition continues to stay in place, generally speaking. If it doesn't, then, generally the parliament will come up with a successor coalition. If that fails, finally there is recourse to the electorate. So, as I say, the subtleties are very great in an established, long-running parliamentary system where the voters understand the rules and the parties understand the rules. There's an absolutely critical role for strategic voting. Voters are expected to care whether a government is formed and stays in office. This has implications that we will spell out in just a moment. Now, where do hybrid systems come in? Hybrid systems come in because constitution writers are constantly trying to find a way of synthesizing the best aspects of both systems. They want the definitive outcome that you get in a presidential election, but they also want the subtleties of a parliamentary regime, and they try to get this by having a semi-presidential system. I would say on the whole that semi-presidential systems have been spectacularly unsuccessful. But there's always this sort of lodestone out there that people are trying to take advantage of. Okay, how is it that voters get to play this subtle role in established parliamentary systems? Well, there are certain things that we know about voter preferences, things that are absolutely critical. Firstly, voters really don't like elections. Well, okay, elections are central to democratic governance, but voters hate elections. Elections, interrupt their favorite soap programs in the afternoon with stupid party political broadcasts. Elections mean that they have to watch these stupid candidates day after day after day making the same promises as the day before, or even worse, making different promises. And it goes on for months. It goes on for years in the United States. But in the United States, they have a problem. They can't really admit that they hate elections, because that would be blaming the Founding Fathers, and in the American system, the Founding Fathers are practically divine. So you can't blame them. You can't blame the current administration, because they don't get to call elections. It's written into the Constitution. So you don't hear much about how much voters hate elections. But we do know that voters dislike elections, and I will come on to that in just a moment. Voters do like government, or at least they dislike ineffectual government. They do like to have a definitive outcome. They do like to have a government in place. They do not like watching coalition negotiations. They do not like watching a government fall down. That is why, if the negotiations fail, if the government does not continue in office, somebody will be blamed. In the Netherlands, they have the saying, if you break it, you pay. You know, just like in a shop, if you knock something off the shelf and it breaks, yeah, you bought it. And that is what keeps coalition governments together. And finally, really critical, voters like large parties. Large parties will get their vote, other things being equal. That is what is at the basis of the wasted vote syndrome. In a presidential system, voters do not get the chance to exercise any of these preferences. All they get to do is make a stupid choice, and even more stupidly, they get to make 3 different choices that can easily be contradictory. In parliamentary systems, they get to weigh all these different preferences. A preference for policy, a preference for large parties, a preference for not having unnecessary elections, and so on. Okay, let's take these one at a time. Voters dislike elections. We know that they dislike it because when voters judge that they are being subjected to an unnecessary election, they tend to blame and penalize the party of the person who was supposedly responsible. That is why in Britain, governments dare not call an election after 2 years just to take advantage of good economic conditions, because the voters know they're not supposed to have an election in 2 years, and they will penalize any party that does that. That's why in France, you can get an election immediately after a presidential election in order to bring the parliament into line with the presidential preferences. But you can't have another one 2 years later, because everybody knows that there isn't supposed to be an election 2 years later. My God, you're going to interrupt my favorite soap programs for another election? Don't be dumb. You know, I think it was Mitterrand tried that one and got it in the neck. He only had 2 years of a parliament that agreed with him, because he got greedy and wanted to get another 5 years while the going was good. The electorate wouldn't allow him. Okay, they dislike ineffectual government. This follows from their dislike of elections. If they're going to suffer the inconvenience of an election campaign, they want some benefit in return. They want to see governments moving out of previous governments being replaced. They want to see new policies being enacted. That's their reward for having had to put up with this election campaign that they didn't want. And of course, this does not mean that voters are going to make good judgments, except perhaps in Switzerland. What it does mean is that parties dare not test the voters' patience by also in practice is extremely well supported. Size of party moves with party support on a pretty much one-to-one basis, which means that a party that has 50% of the seats, it sounds tautological, it gets 50% of the votes. Obviously, it wouldn't have had 51% of the seats if it didn't have 50% of the votes. But it gets those votes largely because of its size. Everything else is just marginal. How are we doing? Not good. So those are all pluses. There are, of course, a lot of weaknesses, but what I want to focus on are the weakness that comes in the shape of party leaders. Nancy Baumeier wrote a beautiful book published in 2003 called Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times, where she followed through something like 17 case studies of breakdowns of democracy, most of them happening in the 1920s and 30s or in Latin America. And of the 17 cases, all but 2 where the breakdown did not in fact take place, the breakdown was the fault of party leaders. It was not the fault of voters. It was the fault of party leaders generally misconstruing voter opinions and voter behavior. I would assert that party systems, that parliamentary systems reached their apex in about 1948 with the German constitution of that year. That was the best parliamentary constitution that we've seen. Ever since then, there has been a decline in the sophistication of constitutions, as it seems to me party leaders have tended to forget all the rules that I just went through. And we saw a French constitution in 1958, which has over the years improved itself by getting rid of the worst mistakes that de Gaulle made in writing that constitution, but which still has this terrible defect that a president that is really hated cannot be removed until the next presidential election. So the party of that president suffers in a way that it would never do in a parliamentary regime. It would just change its leader, and you'd have a new prime minister, and that new prime minister might very well enable you to win the next election. Look what's happening in France right now. The party of the president has not a hope in the next election because that party is saddled with the guy who is president. That doesn't happen in a parliamentary regime. European elections. Oh my God, what a mess. Give voters election every 5 years with no conceivable, observable purpose, and you subject them to something they dislike with no benefit in return. Of course they're not going to vote. And of course there are all sorts of additional costs, such as the fragmentation of party systems as people learn to vote for parties that are not large, because in a European Parliament election it doesn't matter whether the party is large or not. It's not going to have government power anyway. The really interesting case is the direct election of the president in Israel in 1996, when the electoral system was changed to give each voter 2 votes, one for the party that they wanted to seat and one for the president. This completely disconnected the choice of government from the choice of legislative representative, and meant that people no longer had an incentive to take account of how large the party was going to be and to vote on the basis of party size. They could, just like in America, vote for the party they prefer because the government was taken care of with their other vote. It was a terrible mistake. Party system exploded in size. The size of the largest party declined, especially the size of the party of the person who was going to be president. Why waste your second vote voting for the same party again? You know, obviously you're going to vote for a party that you prefer on some other basis. After 3 elections, they had to change the system back again in order to recouple people's concern for government formation to their concern for policy. Finally, fortified PR systems, which we are seeing more and more talk of. This completely, this is effectively the same thing as giving people 2 votes. The Constitution now is going to take care of who's going to be the government. It'll just add seats to the winning party until that party has a majority. So the voter doesn't have to worry about which party is going to have a majority. The voter can just vote for the party that they prefer. This is an absolutely horrendous idea that the Greeks have now been using for quite some elections, and that the Italians have started to use as well. And if one just thinks, if one just takes account of the principles that I've enunciated and thinks, what should one do to harness voter motivations to help you get just 2 choices, instead of cutting the link between voter motivations and choice? It's very simple. Institute a rule that only 2 parties will get seats. Now the voters have a huge incentive to vote for a party that can actually win, and parties have a huge incentive to combine themselves into parties that are viable contenders. A very simple difference in policy, which I'm sure we would have seen if parliamentary leaders had the kind of subtle understanding of the subtle relationship between voters and parties that I've been talking about. I would like to leave you with this suggestion. Political scientists have a very important role to play in educating not just people in our universities, not just university students, but party leaders about the nature of the relationship between voters and parties in a parliamentary system. It's perfectly clear from the examples that I've just gone through that party leaders do not understand this relationship. It's up to us to do so. I have a wonderful little quote from a French ex-prime minister who at the time was president of the Senate, and who gave a little speech of welcome to the ECPR when it had its meeting in Paris in the late 1980s. He said, it was a reception in the president's residence, the president of the Senate's residence in the center of Paris. Beautiful, beautiful residence. And he said, here we are together in this beautiful building of which I am the temporary tenant. Me, an amateur, you professionals. I thought, that was so kind that someone who was clearly one of the most professional politicians in France should say, you're the professional and I'm the amateur. But my God, he was right.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a rare example at the end on how politicians look at our profession. But I think we're going to continue with Victor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the beginning, I would like to ask Dubravka to open the last slide from my previous presentation, if you have it on desktop. Let me to apologize since I did not have enough time to prepare my presentation, since I got the program last night. But anyway, I didn't like to use the opportunity to say a few words about this topic in my country. So, yes, this is inclusiveness, yes, thank you. I will use one of the tables prepared for my previous presentation for the beginning. So this is the role of the inclusiveness. And if we analyze this table, we will see that the final grades are relatively high or very high. But since the analysis was done on what is written in the party documents, And in the case of Macedonia, I would like to propose to put it aside, to forget this, because the informal practices, if we analyze results of the informal practices, we will face a very different situation in the practice. Since we have such a situation, maybe it is worth to mention only two cases when we had not previously such powers for party leaders in the party documents. First one is the case with the leader of Democratic Union for Integration. So following the current political crisis in Macedonia as a result of serious security crisis, internal problems, wiretapping scandal, and so on. In order to find a way out of the situation, the party presidency of this party empowered him to propose alone measures how to find way out of the crisis. And what he undertook, he replaced all the ministers of his party in the government with very young, publicly unexposed faces. Nobody knew them before. And we have another cases with the party leader of the main opposition party, Social Democratic Alliance of Macedonia, who had neither charisma nor informal possibilities of the previous head of the party. So at the last party congress, he was empowered to nominate presidents of the local organizations. So giving him authority following their nomination to have influence over these people. So these are just two examples that could present what is the current situation in the country. And if you ask me what to do and how to overcome the situation, the answer is not at all simple. So decision makers in the country, in this case party leaders and party leaderships, are not in favor of any changes in direction of democratization. So this is a real problem we are facing. But on the other side, I have no idea how to change informal practices. So we can make changes in internal law regulation, but how will you change informal practices? Maybe I can see one small window as far as my country is concerned. There is current debate aiming to promote need for changes in electoral law by introducing open lists for parliamentary election. Maybe so the scientists, so the public opinion in the country in this respect could make some proposals that could be in the direction of our today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting proposal. So you don't change party rules, you change the electoral system. You try to change party rules indirectly. I think Michael can catch up on that later on. We're going to continue. Is Elma?
Yes, it's me again. I'm going to read some small part from the text that has written Professor Suad Arnautovic, who is sending you greetings. He wasn't able to be with all of us. So I'll try to say something short about model of optimal accommodation of political representation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Critical and creative authors' discourse made possible for us to get an insight in phenomenology of political representation and identifying ideological misconceptions of monoparty system, but also an insight in modern types of and forms, also scientific discussions related to the phenomenon of political representation. The author researched political representation in Bosnia and Herzegovina in two levels. On theoretical and methodological level, it means abstract and concrete historical level. A long-term and stable development of democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina requires realization of full constitutive status of all three peoples on the entire territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, understanding change in constitutional and legal system of both state and lower levels of power. Such an effort should result in full national and citizens' equality and realization of all other freedoms and rights for all the citizens of our country. In compliance with theoretical and empiric results of researches, the author concludes that it is possible to search electoral reform as a new electoral system in Bosnia and Herzegovina based on the total European and generally democratic achievements. At the first place, election should assure proportionality of the number of the received electors' votes with the number of seats of every political option in a political representation body. In this way, equality and political non-discrimination of the citizens, voters would be realized. However, the proportional system or its combination with plurality system makes possible both social and parliamentary balance, protects and establishes legitimacy and legality of the elected representatives. According to the author's conclusion, the key of the modern political representation is in the sovereignty of its national citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, since in its future BNH also can and should be developed as a sovereign and equal decentralized citizen state with wide local self-management. This is the way for BNH as an international subject to be fully equal to its neighbors and other democratic states of Europe, qualified to independently solve all those issues to be solved by its neighbors as well, and other states created by dissolution of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, but jointly and on equal footings with all sovereign and democratic states within the collective decision-making in regional, European and Atlantic, also world integrations. And that is all.
Thank you very much. So we move country and we move to Dubravka. Already, yes.
Okay. Well, me and my colleague, who is mostly on the 4 recently established political parties, first of which is Social Democrats, which is a party which derived from the Social Democratic Party of Montenegro, then the Democrats, or Democratic Montenegro, which has derived from the Socialist People's Party, Civic Movement, URA, and Demos, which has derived from the Democratic Front. So 3 out of 4 of these political parties have derived from political parties which have a long history of acting and running for elections in Montenegro, ever since, most of them, since the beginning of the introduction of the multipartyism in Montenegro, apart from the Democratic Front, which was established in 2012, I think. So, and even the 4th party, which is the Civic Movement URA, also is presided by a person who was active in the 90s in the politics of Montenegro and used to have a different party with which he ran in elections. So all of these parties can be considered new in terms of their names and their recently formed and established statutes, but when it comes to their presence in Montenegrin politics, it is widely disputed whether we can really call them new in terms of their practice in politics. So we have focused primarily on internal party democracy when examining their actual inclusion and autonomy within political parties, and we have focused on indicators that were introduced by Professor Čular from Croatia, who differentiates between 3 types of indicators within the dimension of autonomy. So first we have members' rights, which autonomy of the local level as the second indicator, and influence of the local level on central party offices. And each of these indicators is related to certain practices and organizational aspects of political parties. So when it comes to members' rights, it primarily refers in the statutes of political parties that we have studied to expressing views and opinions and running for party offices and being elected to certain party offices. So members' rights are very limited in all of the political parties that we have examined, and they do not extend to any possibility of actually influencing decision-making process. Then when it comes to the second indicator, which is the autonomy of the local level, it is also very similar among the parties that we have examined. So the local level has particularly high level of autonomy when it comes to election of local executive bodies, when it comes to campaigning, and when it comes to realization of local programs. But it also lacks influence on the central party office, which is the third indicator comprised by this theory. So the only party among these 4 that we were examining that stands out from the group is Civic Movement URA, which provides that 1/3 of municipal board presidents have the possibility to request a meeting of the central committee of the party to initiate certain changes when it comes to the program of the central party office. When it comes to the dimension of inclusion, Čular also differentiates between 3 indicators, first of which is direct participation of members in the decision-making process, which is again very limited in case of each of the political parties that we have been examining. And there is a possibility of taking part in conventions, which are the representative bodies in all of the political parties that we were studying. And these conventions have powers when it comes to creating statutes, when it comes to choosing presidents of political parties, but it's the only influence they can exercise within this body. So the second indicator refers to powers and prerogatives of conventions versus the executive bodies of political parties. And here, as I said, we have conventions which have the power to create statutes, which have the power to choose candidates and final option for presidential function, whereas the executives partake in the rest of the processes within political parties, which is the selection of candidates for members of the parliament, proposals of members for the rest of the executive bodies, and also approvals of local level decision-making options. So, and the third indicator is the power of the party president, which is actually what was in our focus. And we saw and observed through our study that the nomination of candidates for executive functions was among the primarily functions of the party president, then proposing dismissal of party officials at the local level and direct participation in the executive bodies. Our thesis about high level of presidentialization within political parties, the newly formed political parties in Montenegro, is actually based on a president's possibility to nominate and choose candidates within these executive bodies. So here's a short table that shows that in each of these 4 political parties, presidents have direct participation by just being president. So they take part in coordination board, in central board, and the presidency of Civic Movementura. Then in the rest of the political parties, they take part in executive board, the main board, and the presidency. And what was interesting in the case of Demos is that when it comes to president's participation in the main board, it is interesting to know that the main board proposes members of executive board, the members of municipal board, and members of the presidency, which means that the president inside this party actually has a potential to influence election and selection of candidates and final representatives and members in each of these executive bodies. So not only on the national level, but also on the local level of party organization. So, in conclusion to our analysis, we say that the newly formed political parties in Montenegro have a centralized structure which provides extensive powers to presidents to a certain extent. However, high level of presidentialization can be observed in the decision-making process in each of these political parties. So even when it's not that obvious from the statutes of political parties that the powers and prerogatives of the party presidents are large, in the decision-making process it comes across as quite visible a feature of these political parties that the presidents exercise high-level influence over the decision-making. So we were actually talking about it during the previous panel, but the decision-making process as defined in the statute is not the only form of making decisions within political parties. There are plenty of informal channels where presidents of political parties exercise high influence over the decision-making. And so finally, our final conclusion was the constitutional constraints and the party genetics alone do not provide reason enough for presidentialization in Montenegro. So these conditions have certain influence, but alone they do not provide for the reason and behind the presidentialization of political parties, I again say, in Montenegro. So when it comes to constitutional setting, and the arguments that were made by Shugart and Samuels, the main premise is that presidentialization can only be found in presidential system, not in parliamentary ones, because political parties mimic institutions. And what we have found that maybe lacks and it's not explained enough is what is the reason behind political parties mimicking institutions. And I will go back to this again. So when it comes to party genetics, the main premise in this case is that presidentialization is also affected by parties' creation. And we have discussed with Zlatko and Nicoleta, who presented their paper, whether the DPS can be an example of a party that is highly presidentialized, so to say. And so it is our conclusion that DPS actually satisfies both conditions, both party genetics and the constitutional setting. The party genetics, because DPS is a party that has derived from the Communist Party and has had this the same people in the decision-making bodies ever since. So the party genetics has had a very high influence over what we now call the presidentialization and the large powers of the party president. On the other hand, there was some discussion on whether the DPS actually fulfills the condition of mimicking institutions, and when it comes to parliamentary system and the democratic system, it definitely doesn't mimic mimic these institutions when it comes to presidentialization. But having in mind that it has derived from a communist party, which was established within an authoritative setting, then we can say that maybe the DPS was actually mimicking those institutions that existed in the 90s, thus satisfying the condition of constitutional constraints. So, but the newly formed parties, as I said, lack at least one of these preconditions. Firstly, because they were, as I said, newly formed, and their party genetics can only to a certain extent explain the high level of presidentialization and justify it by the fact that they have derived from political parties that were highly presidentialized. But then again, it lacks this condition which refers to constitutional setting and Montenegro being parliamentary instead of presidential system. So we think that the third independent variable that should be introduced, as was the case with our colleagues, is the electoral system. And in Zlatko's presentation, he referred to the type of lists which provide incentives for candidates and presidents to have a strong role. But what we have referred in our paper is that it's the de Verger's law on electoral system, which provides that the type of electoral system influences the type of party system. So the proportional system which we have in Montenegro has led to creation of a multi-party system with the dominant party, and the main premise of ours is that political parties mimic the party system rather than the institutions and the institutional setting due to their need to achieve better election results. So parties in Montenegro, which has a dominant party that has been winning elections ever since the 90s, have this incentive to achieve better results by adjusting to their environment in terms of the party system, not the political system. So our premise is that the party system, either party system or electoral system, should be introduced as variables, with the electoral system maybe as an independent variable and party system as a dependent variable, which highly depends on the type of electoral system. But this is all, of course, open to discussion and comments and corrections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dubravka. So we're moving to our last country, I guess, and the last presenter, Marcela.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to read an article doing by me and other three colleagues. The Organization of Parties and Internal Party Democracy in Albania. The establishment of political pluralism in Albania created for the first time the legislation on political parties. Political life was based initially on December 19 decree, which regulated the activity of political parties based on four elements: creation, expansion, funding, and restrictions. So the decree on political parties acted as a formal law during the first 6 months of political pluralism between December 19 and May 91, and development of the first multi-party election in Albania. Besides the elements with deep contradiction between its limitations and the democratic standards aspired from the new political elite, the decree itself contained an essential nonsense contradiction. So in April 91 remained in force the constitution of the communism period, according to which, under Article 3, Labour Party of Albania was the only form of state and society, and that the creation of any other form of political parties were prohibited. This profound paradox helps to understand the huge difference between practical political developments and its legal ground. The latter remained theoretical, unsupported, and experimental in a country like Albania, in which for over 46 years of totalitarian party state regime, the directives of the party state had more value than the constitution or the laws in place. So with the law of the 91, remained in effect for 9 years until 2010, during which 2 rotation political took place and 6 political elections were conducted. More especially 3 parliamentary and 3 local elections, as well as 2 national referendums. Some of the main improvements of the new law relate to the prohibition of political parties, establishment and functioning on ethnic, religious, regional grounds, the obligation of each party to have different names and symbols, and the prevention of political parties to create youth or children organization. In this matter, the prohibition of religious party was related to the fact of 4 religions coexistence, while the majority of population in Albania, being atheist, could be line parallel configuration of the new system party and the source of the new social conflict. So the prohibition of the youth organization was due to the negative experience that Albania had from the ill use of youth during the communist period. As regard the financial issue, an innovation was the permission of gifts and benefits when they came from parties or international unions of parties, to the extent not extending the financial assistance granted by the state. Article 23. The aid prohibition from financial and material support of political parties from country public entities, as well as state capital participation entities. So, Albania officially agreed by referendum in '98 to the new constitution, which dedicated political parties a particular article. So, under Article now of the constitution, the political parties were freely created. Their organization shall conform democratic principles. Political parties and other organizations whose program and activities are based on totalitarian methods, indicate on supporting racial, religious, regional or ethnic hearted, using violence to take power or influencing state policy, as well as those of secret category, are prohibited by law. So the new constitution required the remaking on the basic laws and organic laws of all constitutional institutions, including political party. The new law was adopted 2 years later in 2000, and the main innovation of this new law were the increase of the minimum signature number from 300 to 500 citizens. And the most important changes, the amendment law in 2011, were the increase of the signature minimum number from 5,000 to 500 to 3,000 voters. I have to emphasize on another important issue for the Albanian parties, the fact that the legislation does not stipulate the obligation to register in the party's national register, which should monitor and continuously reflect changes and updates of the political parties. So, as regards the structural organization and party development, I have to emphasize that the Albanian political parties are organizational structure, and their organizational structure is identical and is based on the classic form of the former Communist Party. So they have national coverage, is based on territorial units, have youth, women structure, sections, have regional organization as well, executive leadership with the dominant leader. Consequently, more than half of the political parties created after the '92 are formed from individuals or groups of individuals, which are former members of Socialist Party or Democratic Party, excluded for their critical opinions. Rather than enhancement of the political spectrum, there is a fragmentation of the 2 major parties, mainly from the lack of internal democracy, and increase the impact of the authoritarian leaders. Another important thing that I have to emphasize is the fact that the future of the Albanian parties, as the majority of parties in the region, is the context change of constitutions, of their status and rules of functioning. The most significant changes related of two elements, the mandate election of the party leader and the formula of electing leading bodies, leadership or secretariat. By the mid of the 19th, the parties changes their mind and remove the restriction by statutory changes, giving them leaders an indefinite mandate. Overall, none of the parties with parliamentary representation in these 20 years held a regular election mandate for leaders. So the same person have run without limits in some cases up to passing away. While in the recent years, the leadership is almost in Albania entirely a byproduct of co-opting rather than competition. For example, after the 2013, the Democratic Party in opposition created a super leadership with about 55 members, 90% of which were selected from the function they had before, therefore, not through competitive voting. During the last years, the four major parties in Albania have held direct election for the party leader, but the race that they has been just formal, either a single candidate or a formal second candidate selected by the winner. So the distortion of the direct election have no positive effect in increasing the representative level of political parties or to assembly new members. So rather it has seen as an act of politically correct, in line with the modern development trend of parties, but without the possibility for a political change of parties. As regards the fragile democracy within the Albanian political parties, we have to emphasize that, on the other hand, the two major parties in Albania, so the Socialist Party and Democratic Party, have the same level of inclusion indicator. Each of them have respectively held election for its leader and leadership member, and the third main political party in Albania, which is the Socialist Movement for Integration, present the same involvement indicators, differing only through the low level of local autonomy. And as a conclusion and recommendation, in 2008, the two major parties, Socialist Party and Democratic Party, amended the Albanian constitution and the electoral system, experimenting with a regional proportional system with closed list and constructive motion for the Prime Minister. Separation from the model of the popular parties of horizontal extension by switching to electoral parties with vertical extension of the decision-making patterns is an essential feature for the vast majority of political parties in Albania. And the second largest problem of the political parties is the profound difference between the legal basis, law on political parties, Party Act of Association, statutes, the Constitution and the Electoral Code. Albania has only a modest experience in democracy after a long dictatorship. An experience and the tendency to create absolute majorities, strong parties and strong leaders with compressive impact continue to be dominant in the Albanian political spectrum. This has created an elite of untouchable people who control political parties and through them the political system of decision making. And as a recommendation, the main challenge of the Albanian political parties remain the internal democratization. The law political parties require a comprehensive enhancement, including the respective parties' identification documents, and the electoral system deserves supplementary attention to be more open to provide competitive opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it seems to me that a lot of suggestions to kind of democratizing party leadership selection seem to actually target the electoral system, not so much kind of party rules. But I think we can come back to that in the discussion together after Michael gave us his thoughts.
Yes, my thoughts. I suppose speaking, at least as a one-time political scientist, one of those people whom Mark Franklin would put their faith in to reform the political system and give us things that work, I should be careful in what I say. But I think when I was here before, I had the same have the same observation, and maybe I can develop it a little more. In the 1960s, when I first became politically conscious, I guess, there was a concern about parties in the West being insufficiently democratic, governed by not single individuals, but by groups of individuals who made their decisions in what were called smoke-filled rooms. So when the British Conservative Party needed a new leader, one emerged. They always emerged. They weren't elected or appointed, they emerged from somewhere. And of course, American presidential candidates emerged from smoke-filled rooms where the powers that be in the party decided who should be the head of the party. And in the 1960s, when democracy was all the rage, and we thought if only we have a lot more people participating in politics, we can improve the lives of everybody and move away from boring old representative democracy to something a bit more direct. The concern was to make parties more accountable to their members in all respects. I think there were a lot of parties had always done candidate selection locally, but picking a party leader was another matter. And gradually, I think, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even later, in a lot of West European countries, there was a movement towards giving the party members rather more say in who the party leader was. This reached its ludicrous, I think, conclusion in Britain relatively recently, when the departing leader, a man called Miliband, whose father was a political scientist of sorts, but not the right sort of political scientist, thought the party should open up leadership selection to supporters, not necessarily members, although they would be members. They just had to pay, I think, €3 to become a member, and then they could pick the next leader. That gave them, eventually, a completely unelectable leader, a leader who appealed hugely to the people who were mobilized to join the party, but had the support of only about 1 in 10 of those actually elected to sit in Parliament for Labour, and probably a lot of other and Labour voters as well. So it certainly democratized the party, but not to the functioning of the democracy more generally. And I think that's a concern, and I guess that was the concern that Mark Franklin was touching on in his talk about all the ways in which people seek to fix what they think of as what's wrong with parliamentary democracy, and finish up by making it worse. It doesn't always make it worse. Party primaries, which were the way of democratizing the presidential system in the US, I guess gave us some presidents who will go down as being quite good presidents in their way. at the moment, at least, people seem to think Kennedy was a good president, though how he will be viewed in 100 years' time is another matter. But Clinton seemed to be quite a good president. Don't think he'd have come out of a smoke-filled room. Kennedy wouldn't, and probably Jimmy Carter wouldn't either. But the electorate decided they wouldn't like him. But you wouldn't have had Donald Trump. He wouldn't have come out of a smoke-filled room. They wouldn't have let him in the smoke-filled room. So you change the system. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. Now, what can we do about these things? Now, here, you know, the problem is quite different. The lack of democracy in political parties bears no resemblance whatever to the lack of democracy in political parties that people were moaning about in Western Europe in the 1960s and 70s, or even now. I guess it's a lot more serious. There are solutions, of course. One can fiddle around with the rules and regulations, but you can also ask, why is it that somebody doesn't set up a political party that's democratic? And all those people out there who want nothing but a democratic party will flock to it. And it will win the election by a landslide. But of course it won't. It doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Well, because there's no free market in political parties. It takes a long time for them to become established. The fault of that is essentially the voter, poor old voter again. But competition between parties ought to be the answer to all these problems. Because if there's a hole in the market, if there's something that's not being done, then somebody can set up and do it. But I do find it striking that you know, we don't have, you know, the equivalent even of green parties that win relatively few votes in Europe as a whole, and relatively few votes in Western Europe, but do seem to be democratic to a fault, well, to a fault, and there seems to be no parallel to that here. I was in India a couple of years ago, where parties and parties run by single leaders are a bit of a problem, and in Delhi they set up the Common Man Party. Now it's a Delhi party, but that means, you know, there's about 100 million people who vote for it, so it's sizable enough, but it's struggling. It is rather different, and it's struggling, but it was, I suppose, an example of the fact that that the system could throw up a challenger to the established order that would be rather different. The main solution I heard really put forward was changing the electoral system. Economists are usually convinced that only by changing the electoral system you can fix anything, because you just change the incentives. And on the whole, I think political scientists are of the view that the electoral system is somewhat overrated as a way of changing things, Duverger accepted. But I love the idea of open list systems. I live in what's effectively an open list system, and everybody complains about it. Politicians complain about it, and economists complain about it, and political scientists say it's good fun, stick with it. What happens in open list systems is that the voters get to vote for whoever they like. Unfortunately, as in referendums, they vote for the wrong people. And in addition, they set up terrific competition between members of the same party for votes. Well, that's very good in a way, but it depends what you're competing about. You might compete for ideological purity. You might compete to say, this is the solution to that problem, which would be very good, but they don't. They compete to say, I can represent you better than that fellow down there. I can bring more jobs. It's the same jobs. I can do all sorts of things for you, none of which they can do. So rather, I can pretend to do all sorts of things for you by finding out when jobs are coming to the area before the newspaper says, and then I can tell you that there are jobs coming. It doesn't do anybody any good, but on the other, it's good in the system because people feel they have a candidate that they voted for that represents them. That's good, but it's illusory. So, does it make the parties more democratic? Well, no, it doesn't really, because the party still has to put the party label on the candidate. And candidate selection is done by party members, but party leaderships can overrule things and they can add candidates. So it's an open list system, and the voters love it. The voters would never give it up because it gives them a bit of control. But whether it gives them the sort of control that Mark Franklin was talking about at the beginning, to decide on a government, to decide the broad direction of policy, no, it's not used like that. It's used to play another game completely. So I'm all in favor of open list systems. It would be interesting, but it's not going to solve the problem, whatever the problem is. It'll probably create new problems. That's my cheery thought for the day.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we have quite some time for discussion, and I think we'd like to kind of pick up on that because I think it's an interesting thought. You know, we were talking about kind of party democratization, party leadership, and we did indeed hear, it was kind of my observation too, we did hear a lot of this kind of talk about what you change in the electoral system, to an open list system, or in your case you mentioned kind of the increase in signatures that you needed in order to kind of put a party list forward. That's how I understood it. And there was actually very little mention in terms of, you know, let's introduce some kind of party regulation which regulates how parties are supposed to function. You know, I mean, that would be the most concrete and most straightforward solution to that. You know, to say, okay, you know, you oblige parties to kind of structure in a certain way and introduce some kind of democratic structures. And that wasn't mentioned. That wasn't mentioned at all. So I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about this possibility, like just leaving aside that you kind of need parties to agree on introducing something like that. And you find you need a majority of that, so that kind of might be difficult to begin with, but at least that would be kind of a natural route. And some countries do that, you know. I think the Germans, we don't have any Germans here, but I think the Germans have kind of quite explicit party regulations and how parties have to operate and how you have to function. They're rare, but cases like that exist, and maybe that would be one kind of starting point for the discussions.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think it came out in the paper on Albania. I mean, you can introduce those rules, but somebody's got to enforce them. And who's going to enforce them? Well, the major party in power is going to enforce them. And will they enforce them if it changes the nature of that part? No, it probably won't. You know, rules are great as long as you trust the people who will enforce them.
Yeah, democracy is great when what you are asking is for people to choose between teams who might form a government. Nice, simple choice. People are able to make that choice. Probably doesn't, cosmically speaking, matter very much which team wins. They're both perfectly competent. So people can make a mistake when they vote for the wrong one, and nobody's much hurt. Democracy that goes beyond that starts to become more and more dangerous the more you democratize. Let me give an example. I mentioned post-war constitutions, post-World War II constitutions that were not of the same standard as the German one. The one that takes the cake was the Italian constitution of 1944, where their desire for democracy was so great that they instituted a secret ballot in the legislature. Okay? Parliamentarians got to vote on bills without recording what their vote was. How democratic can you get? I mean, you want secret ballot at elections. Of course you do, so that voters won't be bought and can't sell their votes. But if you have secret ballot in the legislature, then no voter knows what his or her representative did. There's no way they can hold the parties to account. So a secret ballot, which sounds like a good thing at the electorate level, is a terrible thing at the legislature level. Well, there are lots of things like that change their meaning when they happen in different places. And democracy within political parties may not be nearly as good a thing as it sounds, just as referendums turn out not to be nearly such a good thing, except in Switzerland, as they sound.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as I mentioned, maybe something different of what you expected. So, the change of internal party regulation was the first thing that came to my mind when we opened the question. But I said that the problem is not in the internal party regulation. The problem is in its implementation. So, unfortunately, informal practices are much more important than what is written in internal party regulation, and this is one side of the problem. Other side, I also mentioned that the party leaders and the party leadership are not at all in favor of even launching discussion on the topic, not to discuss or to take some decision. We have in our societies even larger problem. So this is or these are clientelistic links with the party in power, but also with the party leadership in opposition, with different spheres of society. Let's say we have a strong such clientelistic link between media as kind of power in a society that could open and launch such issues with the party leaderships. On the other side, what is the power or what is interest of the party membership? For the time being, they showed neither interest nor real power to just to open the issues. I have information from one of my friends who is part of the high leadership of the biggest party in the country, and he informed me that since some high-positioned members of the party launched the issue that it would be good that the party democratize from inside, and also maybe to introduce open elections for all the positions. So the party leader opened debate about the issue, and following the long-lasting discussion, the conclusion was to task the person who initiated the issue to have a press conference and to inform the public opinion and the media, and the answer to be based on three theses. So the issue was opened, discussed, and negatively closed. So this is reality in the countries, and that's why I mentioned to use any opportunity that is at least connect it with the topic, just to raise public awareness of the issue, and maybe to use the public opinion to make press on the parties to discuss openly on the topic. Thank you.
Okay, we are the case when we have proved closed lists and open lists. None of them are success. So, if an open list, with an open list, you mentioned that the electorate could make a bad decision. With a closed list, if the leader is the leader or the leadership, closed leadership, is the group that make the decision. Is it better or is it worse? Our experience, we want democracy.
But that's a process.
In the real terms of democracy.
I think when people say they want democracy, they mean they want a government that does wonderful things, which is not democracy. What the government does has got nothing, I think, to do with democracy. Democracy is a process which is supposed to give you good government, but it might not do so. Well, I mean, it's an arguable point. People have been arguing what democracy meant for rather a long time, but one can distinguish between a process and an outcome. Will that particular process give you better politicians who are better able to deliver good policy? That's certainly the argument that's been made against the open lists as they exist in Ireland at the moment. It gives us worse politicians than it would if they were selected somewhat more centrally by the party. And that's not the parties saying that, that's commentators.
Professor Marsh was mentioning about the law enforcement regarding how to oblige political parties to introduce democratic procedure within the parties. As this is almost impossible to enforce. But actually, I think that I was reading Karvonen book regarding the Finnish experience, because in the Finnish law there is obligation that political parties should have democratic, but it is not actually obligation. It's more as incentives. If they want to get the funding from the state, then they should follow democratic procedures. So actually, maybe not to enforce or force them, but maybe to give them incentives. If they want the funding from public funding, then they should follow some or implement democratic procedures. Because I'm noticing the different point of view or perspective, those who are coming from, let's say, those countries that are part of the first wave of the democratization, but we who are coming from the countries of the third wave, we have different perspective, because actually in our case the political parties are not accountable, the leadership, national leadership is not accountable, then we have big problems. So if we are just trying desperately to find some incentives to democratize them and to have better results.
Well, you have big problems, but you don't have anything like the problems you had when you were killing each other 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, the thing that democracy is good for, that there's absolutely no doubt about, is it's good for choosing the next people who will run the country after the present people no longer able to, because they died or whatever. You know, for thousands of years, the only way of solving a succession crisis was by killing people, sometimes thousands of people. Democracy solves that problem. That's the only thing it does. You know, in addition, maybe you might get better policies, But for God's sake, let's be grateful about not going around killing each other.
Can I'd probably see a bit more in democracy than that. But as far as means to ensure that rules are followed, those suggestions are excellent. And I mean, we had a recent legislative change to try and ensure that parties nominated more women, because again, it's probably partly because of the electoral system. Very few women became candidates. There are other reasons, but very few women were selected as candidates. And a change was made that parties had to, this election and the next election, I think 30% of their candidates had to be women. And if they weren't, then they wouldn't get funding. 30% of candidates were women. They had to work quite hard to find them. In Ireland, yes, they had to work quite hard to find them that time. Next time it might be easier, but they did it because you know, they would need the funding. I suppose the question I would have for you is, if you brought that in Montenegro or wherever else, that, okay, you have to have this mechanism and that mechanism to select the party leader every year, would that make any difference? Or would whoever was in government at the time find some mechanism to circumvent that if they chose to do so?
I just making a comment myself on that. I mean, I remember like 20 years ago there has been kind of this strong kind of what they called it, kind of new institutionalism, something like that. You know, where kind of was a strong belief in political science that, you know, really, like we were talking before, a lot of about behavior, and then like when you fix institution, when you change institution, you're going to change behavior. And I think, you know, that's not probably the paradigm anymore. And there's a realization that, you know, you can change institutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you change behavior. But I do agree that, you know, there's some kind of trying to create incentives to kind of make politics more accountable. That it seems to be the case in many of the kind of political and party systems in Balkan countries is probably a kind of a heroic attempt, and at least for us to try. So I would kind of agree on that, but with probably fairly moderate expectations on that, because we know that that kind of, you know, especially party leaders and also party in generals, they have been very smart in kind of bypassing and using kind of informal rules to kind of outperform formal rules, and that's what we've seen in many cases. I just think kind of one other strategy which goes in the direction of what Michael mentioned with respect to kind of representation of women, which actually has been occurring in several countries, was that, you know, if one party actually goes forward and introduces something, this creates quite some pressure on other parties to introduce something similar. And I think, actually kind of choosing leaders in a democratic way, that is something that you see happening. And similar rules like that, so you don't even need to change the constitution or kind of any law. You just kind of create pressure by one party introducing something and the other parties have to follow, because usually to make the argument, we are more participatory, that is something that parties like to put forward. Because they don't go out and say, oh, we don't care about the people and we don't care about democracy, and as a consequence, they would have to kind of adapt that. I wouldn't go too far with the hope, and I think kind of mentioning the example of the US again. I mean the system with the primaries has been hugely kind of has been successful probably in some ways, but it kind of produced a President Trump as well in a highly democratic.
The Tea Party.
It produced the Tea Party, so it kind of pushed, the kind of people's movements within one party to kind of actually make the parties more extreme than you would probably have in a system without the primaries. So you can have like kind of negative, unintentional consequences of a reform with very good intention on making something more democratic and give broader access to decision making within parties.
For presidential election, which is a really strange electoral system with a lot of the defects, and primary election maybe in some other surroundings would have the better results, but in the case when it is possible on presidential election in the United States that the candidate who got a less popular vote to become president, even 3 million, almost 3 million, then primaries are not a problem. Problem is the real electoral system, which is doesn't give the legitimacy. What?
Rhode Island and Arizona do not regard this as a problem. For them, that is the reason why they are in the union. If they had not been given equal weight with other states, they would not have joined.
Yes, but that should not be introduced as a part for electing the president. Then why you need really election?
They gave us the United States.
They are equal in the two houses of the Congress.
I have a suggestion and a comment on Dubravka's paper, and it is really hard to measure intra-party democracy, as democracy is itself on a system level. But I've noticed that you were building your argument on Chular's paper on internal party democracy, but I would suggest you to consult a little but very good book on measuring intra-party democracy. It was published with Springer in 2013, and it was the authors are Thomas Pogunke and Benjamin von den Berge, and they develop a very complex scheme on measuring intra-party democracy on 3 dimensions: on dimension of members' rights, organizational structure, and programmatic issues. And you will see they have these 3 dimensions and 3 levels of intra-party democracy, trying to capture at least formal distribution of power within parties. And as for internal party democracies, it's as it is as a concept. Is it more about inclusion, to include ordinary party members or even voters outside the party to select party leader, to select candidates for national elections, for drafting party manifestos? Is it more about what Professor was talking a little while ago about some democratic outcomes like representation of women on the candidates list? Is it about some other democratic outcomes like competitiveness and so on, or is it about distribution of power? And let's imagine a situation that we have two parties, and one party is very inclusive towards ordinary party members and allows party members to select candidates for national elections. And those party members elect only men as candidates. And on the other side, we have a party which is governed by a despot, but he is an enlightened despot. And he decides by himself that there should be 50% of women on party's list. Which party is more democratic? It's hard to tell. Actually, intra-party democracy is somewhere between these two very extreme poles of one that prefers inclusion, the other that prefers representation. Yeah.
Thank you, Dario. It's a very disputable case, of course. Regarding your first comment, when you said that we should maybe build on some other arguments, I agree. We have used this Schuller argumentation just because one of the indicators was the power of the party president in order to build upon that indicator and to develop further towards the presidentialization of political parties. So that is why we chose his type of indicators. But surely we can refer, because this is only a draft paper, so maybe we can add and build upon those indicators as well. When it comes to your second argument, I agree. And we have had the case in Montenegro that several parties have had elections, and the conventions were supposed to decide on the party president. And when fractions within political parties were in favor of other candidates, which was the case in Social Democratic Party, parties in Montenegro tend to split. So these inclusion of members and the possibility of members impact on selection of presidents or political parties actually has led to fragmentation of political parties, not to any high level of democracy in either of these parties. So it's a matter to be further examined for sure. Thank you.
It's obvious that that some people care greatly about whether parties are democratic or not. You know, let's say all the people in this room care about whether parties are democratic or not. But my question really is, do the voters care? Does it actually make any difference to the voters? Do we have any evidence on that one way or another? Because it would seem to me that if large numbers of people actually cared, the situation would change. We're not talking about established party systems where it would be very, very difficult to set up a new party that would take large numbers of votes away from, you know, long established brand names. You know, the parties are relatively flexible, they're relatively new. It ought to be possible to launch a new party, to do all sorts of wonderful things, to win support if voters actually cared about this issue. And I suspect probably that they don't.
Well, if I may add, as you know, we have conducted the comparative candidate survey 2 years ago in Montenegro, and we are now conducting it again. And from the party perspective, more than 70%, and I even think it was 76% of party candidates were in favor of preferential voting or opening of the lists. So they feel that their connection to the voters might have been better if they had the system of open lists or at least preferential voting. And when it comes to voters, it was also the case in Montenegro for the parliamentary elections held 3 months ago that some of the voters and leaders of certain political parties at the local level filed a constitutional appeal against the open lists. Their premise was that voters are prevented from choosing their representatives directly. The Constitution grants them rights to choose their representatives directly, but the electoral system set as it is, with the closed list, prevents them from exercising that right. So even from the voters, from the local level, there were certain initiatives in Montenegro towards opening the list. So we have will on both sides. It's just a matter of progress. Maybe Zlatko can add, yes.
I kind of lean towards this view that, you know, voters do care. Maybe we have to distinguish two types of situations. If you think about, you know, if you ask people, oh, do you want to have kind of more rights to make choices in elections or in direct democracy, you might have kind of not that many people who think they have, except in circumstances where they really feel like there's a democratic deficit. But try to think about the reverse, you know, try to take away people's rights once they've gotten them. And think about Ireland. You know, if you think about you want to introduce kind of a closed list PR party system and take voters the right away to choose individual candidates, I don't think you would be hugely popular making such a proposal in Ireland. Any other last comments? Ideas? So I have a great recommendation to conclude how to avoid kind of decision making in smoke-filled rooms, as Michael introduced at the beginning of his discussion. And it's just you ban smoking in public buildings, and and you don't have decision making in smoke-filled rooms anymore. I think that analogy doesn't work anymore these days. It doesn't necessarily mean banning smoking is going to make leadership selection any more democratic, but it makes it less smoky. We're going to continue tomorrow at 9:30, where we're going to discuss.
But not in this hall, in the smaller hall, at the beginning and entrance of the hotel.
So it's still going to be in this hotel, yes, and then we're going to mainly discuss the continuation of the Balkan Comparative Electoral Study. Is that's going to be the topic? And who's going to actually talk? I'm going to chair. I saw that, but who's going to?
Before this conference, we had some kind of strategic orientation.
Okay.
Meeting of the parties, so we have some conclusion that will be presented tomorrow. And based on that, we will ask for some kind of feedback or some opportunity for research, cooperation.
Okay, so thanks very much to all the presenters, to Michael as a discussant, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the day. Thanks.